Okay. Good evening, everybody. I hope everyone is having a nice evening. So welcome to our open room session, Separated Together Part 2. My name's Emma Case. I'm social practice producer at Open Eye Gallery, and I have with me tonight artist Hafsa Naib and Sarah Hartley from Novus. So I'm going to just get them both to introduce themselves, if that's okay. So Hafsa, if you just want to introduce yourself.
Hello, thank you, Emma. I'm Hafsa, as Emma said. I'm an artist. I'm a writer-director. I do a lot of installation, and I run something called Working Class Film School, which is a youth filmmaking project for 7 to 18-year-olds. Yeah, loving every second.
Thanks, Hafsa. And Sarah, if you want to introduce yourself too.
Sarah Hartley. I'm a creative producer. I got a role at Novus, which is a prison education provider, and my role within there is working around enrichment, creative practice and family.
Thanks, Sarah. Okay, so just before we start, I'm just going to do a bit of housekeeping. We have a chat function on Twitch, which you are free to use throughout. And if you don't have a Twitch account, then feel free, you can ask a question via Twitter, just using the hashtag OpenEye. We have a bit of a time at the end for a Q&A. So any questions, our OpenEye team will forward them on. We're also recording this session, and it will be added to our YouTube channel as well. So tonight we'll be discussing Open Eye Gallery's pilot prison photography project, which has just very recently come to an end. We've been working with incarcerated people and their families using photography as a communicative tool. Together with Novus and HMP Risley, the project explored how photography and creativity can be used as a tool for self-expression, as well as learning new skills to aid rehabilitation. And at the beginning of the project, we hosted our first open rooms, where we explored the ethics, the limitations, the logistics of embarking on a photography project within a prison setting. And tonight, we're going to be reflecting on the project and the adaptations in both creative practice and the facilitation that had to be made due to COVID-19 restrictions. So to begin with, I'm just going to pass you over to Sarah to just give you a bit of an overview of the project.
Thank you. So within my role within Novus, I use creative opportunities to ultimately provide a space where participants can explore, develop personal skills, and generally develop themselves upon release. So that progression from custody through back into society. And one of the things that with Open Eye is devising how we could do that with photography, and looking at how photography could be the space where individuals could explore, play, communication skills, creativity, working with others. And kind of one of the exciting things around the project was really thinking creatively about what we might do. As Emma outlined, there is a number of limitations that can on occasions present barriers, and through our initial conversations, how we might push those barriers and use technology and cameras and equipment to give people a new skill set that they could draw upon, and an opportunity to represent themselves in a new way, which could also be shared with families, and kind of push the curriculum. What could we do within the prison education framework that really supported that rehabilitative culture? And then, as Emma has explained, some of the limitations that were presented to us around the project created further creativity, but kind of had to make us to think a little bit more about how we might enable and achieve the aims that we set out to do. So with regards to the aims, I'm just going to refer specifically. So throughout the project, before COVID, and what we have managed to work through even with COVID, but I'm not going to go into that too much detail. I'm going to let Hafsa go into the creative side of things. But we wanted to build that engagement for creative practice through the prison, and positively foster that creative learning for everybody involved. So again, as I keep saying, that kind of opportunity to explore. Wanted to explore what we could achieve. So again, like I referenced, kind of pushing those boundaries, but exploring to what extent and accessibility of photography we could enable in the kind of restrictions. And really create a two-way learning. So ultimately between kind of the organisation of Novus, but also the organisation and kind of gallery setting of OpenEye, and the professionals who we work with, the photographers, the artists, and kind of how could we really embrace that to bring a new dynamic. One of the big focuses as well for the project was the family connection. So a real focus on how we might open up opportunities to enable that connection with people who are participants within the prison context, but also how they might use creativity to link to their families and loved ones, children and adults, and recognising that photography could be a platform for that. And to just experiment and be creative about the collaboration. What would that look like, and kind of using that as an opportunity to kind of build on. The pilot very much kind of exploring that we intended to kind of trial and test things and kind of really use it as an exploratory space, and then we could build on that for a long-term project, a commitment to that long-term project, which we've certainly got lots of learning which we'll go into further on. But hopefully that's just provided like an overview in terms of what we intended to achieve for the project, and just an outline of kind of the aims and how we saw the partnership with the OpenEye Gallery in Novus and education and the prison context working.
Thanks, Sarah. Yeah, I'm going to pass on to Hafsa now. Just Hafsa, if you want to share a bit about your process and sort of some of the creative outcomes as well from the pilot project.
Yeah, so one of the major things that kind of affected the way the project ran was the looming decision through COVID whether or not the project was going to take place on site, or whether there was going to be another sort of mechanism through which some engagement could happen. And I was really eager to have that decision made, and we did make it, and I think we made it at the right time, because what that meant for me as the artist engaged in this social practice was I could just like think about the parameters now, because already I was thinking I was going to work with photography with men in prison. There were going to be a number of parameters anyway, COVID or not. But I guess I was up for that. I was kind of expecting a lot of movement around that, work, like as Sarah says, to find that collaborative, functional way of working with partners and with collaborators and all the supporting staff that that are around that. So that was always a bit of a challenge. I was always very excited to work in that way as a socially engaged artist. I've worked in that way many times, I'm glad to say. Whereas this was slightly different, of course, with COVID, because all of that, it's almost like the challenges and the barriers kind of, what grew exponentially. It was like, okay, how do you do a photography project with men in prison without that physical on-site engagement and without cameras? So suddenly those sort of challenges really rose. But what helped, and I'll go back to this, is that decision. So once we collectively made the decision to kind of think, okay, on-site work is definitely not on the table here. We are going to have to think of another way. And so postal engagement, sort of thinking about how I could in my studio make these physical packs that could be sent in to the prison. Now, I know that sounds really simple because we've all used the postal service and we're quite used to, even though we don't use it as much as we used to, because that's the other thing about this project, how it's developed, the kind of traditional analog way in which we communicate and work and engage. That has been such sort of a strong characteristic feature of this work, of our project, and we are continuing that because we found some success in that. And I'm going to talk to you a bit more about that. But yeah, so once that decision was made, it was clear that some sort of pack or some sort of content could be made and sent in. So obviously, thinking about how I could work with men I've not met, not knowing anything about the prison as such. Obviously Sarah, and knowing some information about how prisons work and getting myself sort of acclimatized to that. happened, important part of artist research, I guess. I also started to look at a lot of British artists and photographers who worked in that way, worked in prisons, worked in other kind of contexts. Also looked at a wonderful book called Left Shift, which is like an anthology documenting artist practice from the 1970s. So it was really quite interesting because a lot of mail art and postal art was featured in the book, and I thought that was really quite wonderful to find that context and that history and sort of bring it into the project space. So I got a lot from that, a lot of confidence as well, like a lot of strategies and techniques that artists had developed for just using the postal system to make work. Our project was slightly different in that I was faced with the challenge of like creating packs for the men, so the men would engage with the packs. And so the first thing was, well, how do I create sort of the things that I get from photography, like joy, wonder, and insight? These are all the things that photography or the image or the process of looking and making sort of give me. And I know I'm speaking about photography, but you could just extend that to artist practice, to cultural practice. Those really key ideas, that those real visceral sort of feelings you get when you engage. I thought, how on earth am I going to do that? And so I mean, I started in my studio, as all artists do, I guess. I'm going to share my screen because I want to perhaps show you the very first things we did in terms of, so just to go back a teeny step, before we thought about making the packs and I was going to work in this way, I designed a poster to go on site in the prison to actually recruit men. And it's a really important part of socially engaged practice to make sure that, people are given as much information as possible about projects when they are offered to them, and prison is no different. So I will share what I've put together here for us in a hot second. Hopefully you should be able to see quite a moody picture of me there doing something. I
wasn't going to say anything.
You weren't, you were dying to, weren't you? Okay, so let's move on from that. So here we go. So this was the first sort of creative thing I did to set it all off. And I love posters. I just find them really effective visual communicators. And I thought it'd be really good to set the level high in the sense that, invest in that poster so that the men could see something of the artist. So I used it as an opportunity to showcase some pretty slick design skills there. You can see that hand-drawn camera, and the hands, of course, were hand-drawn anyway. The inspiration for it, actually, I've included this little image here. So Johnny Cash in '68 went and performed like a concert in Folsom State Prison in California, which I thought was mad, just amazing. And so I kind of borrowed from that idea a little bit, so you can hopefully see the influence, let's call it. I was inspired.
Very good, Hafsa. I was listening to that in the car last night.
Yeah, you do right with Cash, you do right. So, and then these packs started to emerge. So in the end, I think I made about 5 packs, each very different. I love the idea of putting all this stuff in pizza boxes, because I just like that. So we got these pizza boxes and we just filled them with, I think somebody was joking with Sarah about, well, where's the pizza? And I'm sure Sarah's response would have been, this is to nourish your mind and your soul and your creativity. Because I hope that's what it did for them. So this is just a visual to, give you a quick look into physically what these packs were. So yes, we had art materials, everything had to be kind of packaged and uniform. Equity is really important, equality is really important with this sort of way of working as well. You just want everything available to everyone. The handmade element as well at the top here, with the viewfinders, the apertures, everything was bespoke, everything was made to measure, and in the sense that, I did order stuff for the packs, but a lot of it was handmade. So let's move on from that. So that's just a quick visual of what these packs might have looked like. In the packs, of course, there were lots of activity sheets and various things. The activities were great. They were all about looking and seeing, so there was a lot of stock images that they would get, and they could, look for photos within photos, or look for compositions within compositions. I used poetry and proverbs and writing to engage them, to use that kind of language with the image. And as a writer director, obviously that was, you know, it was pulling all those experiences that I have as a writer director in to these packs. So I'm glad to say that some of the activities were, you know, hopefully getting the men to think visually, but also to think how visuals tell stories, but importantly to think about how we respond to images. And I was quite keen that we start to do that fairly soon. But it was still a photography project. I kept having to remind myself, right, we're still doing photography. This is a photography project. And so very quickly, as I was researching myself and looking at all sorts of different ways that I could support this, we just went back into the history of photography. I mean, we just thought, forget all this, we're just going to go back, like, you know, however many years. And so I started to think about the photogram and think about how we could get light sensitive photo paper in there and use light and objects to create images. These were the ones that I did in my studio for the pack that I sent into the men. So I'm just going to talk a little bit now about that. I've got a couple more slides to show you. Often this process meant I would experiment in my studio with something, you know, pin it, and then think about how to communicate this, you know, so that was essentially the process. So here's a little visual of one of the packs. So clearly the idea was to introduce the idea of photograms in a clear and concise way, in a way that might help to provide some context, some history perhaps. And so the work of people like Anna Atkins became really relevant. We had a couple of participants who were really quite interested in drawing plants and nature, and it felt like that might go a long way. I'm glad to say that that learner did sort of express a lot about that. And also artists like Laszlo Moholy-Nagy, who's a bit further, you know, back in 1926, who made some work. So I thought that was quite interesting to bring in. And then the next slide, you can see how I've included the work that I did as a kind of way of proving that it is possible. Because I'm sure the men must have thought, right, you want me to get this piece of paper, put an object on it, expose it to light, and then wash it. It's quite an odd thing. But I thought that would work well. And this was the main sort of infographic that I kind of was hoping would tie this quite tactile and beautiful process in photography to, you know, together in a way. So I was trying to be as concise as I could, really. And well, you know, we had some of the learners, some of the participants, the learners sort of like struggle with getting clear images, but we're glad to say that attempts were made consistently. So they showed great discipline. And it's almost like, you know, you have to be like a scientist in the lab, and you have to be like an artist in your studio. And I think if the men may have felt at any point during this activity that they might have been any of those two, then I think we've probably achieved a lot, because, you know, they're yeah, that's hopefully what we were, you know, looking to build on. So I didn't stop at photograms. I went on straight in there for pinhole photography. And so I thought, well, obviously we're all analog now. We're going back to some really essential fundamental processes in photography. This is actually quite cool because I'm enjoying this kind of, I do black and white photography, you know, I love it. That's as far back as I go. So then I kind of got this template together and started to devise boxes and things that would work in the studio. And so these are some of those images. Unfortunately, I don't have any more to show you on that. And I think I probably should probably come to a close. But just before I do, so throughout that whole creative process and sort of like the men engaged, the participant, we got a lot of content back. I'm sure we're going to touch on that as we go on in terms of the learning and the successes of the project. So I'll park on that. But for me as an artist, there were like 2, maybe 3 points that became really evident through this way of working. Like it was clear that a lot of photography is that whole act of looking and seeing, and to be able to invest in the way we look and the way we see, I think wouldn't have been lost on these men. I think their insights and the way their perspectives, you know, have been shaped by their experiences was obviously something we were looking to harness and invite, really. So I think that was important. The second dimension or feature to this way of working was just that return to like fundamentals. You know, a lot of it was literally about the mechanisms of the image, you know, yes, composition, but yes, meaning, and yes to what you think it is. So, you know, limited to paper-based materials, you can ask the question, you can set activities up, but then the responses, you may think, you know, when we talk about some of the responses, people may think, okay, that's not the response that might be seen as successful. But one really crucial thing, this is the final thing about this way of working, was it was like incredibly important to me, I think, knowing what the men did and what they didn't do, and the bits that they did, how they did them. It's like every little mark, I cannot stress that enough, every little input, every little response was just magnified so much within this project. And so this idea of scale was really important for us. And finally, Emma, I promise, the whole idea of photography in prison, it's like I started with a few questions myself when I was interested in this work. And my questions were, what kind of visual culture could exist in a prison? You know, what is visual culture of a prison? What does that look like? What does it function as? What is it supposed to do? The second question I had was, could the men use what they have learned in photography to connect with their families? Gosh, what kind of connection could that be? Could they be really creative? Could they say things to their family members that they just couldn't by speaking or by writing? Was there something in the image that could be given to somebody as a way of communicating? I thought that was fascinating. And finally, how actually does an image function in a space under surveillance? I mean, that was like a fundamental thing that kind of drew me in to this context. And having a year with these wonderful people, my partners, and the wonderful men doing what they were doing, you know, I thought to myself that the prison and the gallery, there might be some connection here, because in a prison, the whole notion of permission, consent, identifiability is paramount. It's that kind of visual nature of looking and seeing is really paramount to the security and the running of the prison. And you know, and a gallery is all about looking and seeing. That is existential, actually. The reason that a gallery would exist is because there's meant to be some looking and seeing. So in a very convoluted way, I myself as an artist engaged in this fabulous, great, challenging, wonderful project, have not answered very many questions, but certainly I'm in a position where I'm constantly looking to develop that, but I've also managed to maybe find some connections that I wasn't aware of before. So so I hope that gives everybody a little bit of everything there, and I'll hand back to you, Emma.
Thank you, Hafsa. Thank you. Was that your music playing? Because that was awesome.
I'm sorry, did you hear that? That's not my music at all.
It sounded really nice.
There's a cafe outside my studio, and I think they're getting ready for a gig or something.
It actually worked with what you were saying. It sounded like somebody sort of playing music to go with it. But as you were talking about, we've mentioned the word challenges a few times, and I think this is probably a good opportunity for us to sort of start a bit of a discussion. Just and when I say challenges, I think what's probably good for everybody watching is just to sort of maybe explain the framework of actually the practical element of the project, and so how we executed it in the end with the postal engagement. And so, as both Hafsa and Sarah said, originally the project, we were looking to go in person. So Hafsa would have been going on site, working with a group of learners in a sort of classroom setting. And so instead, because of COVID, we ended up doing a postal engagement. And the postal engagement at the beginning was a sort of holding thing, wasn't it? It was to sort of, the group had said, yes, we want to do this. And because we thought we might be going in after a sort of lockdown period, we thought, well, maybe we should give them something to keep them engaged, so that we're ready to start in person. And then obviously lockdown continued to happen, and that's when we obviously made the decision to keep the postal engagement going. So the postal engagement, Hafsa would make basically her postal pack for each one of the learners. They would then, correct me if I'm wrong, guys, they would then get posted to Sarah at Sarah's house. She would then, on a Monday every 2 weeks, every week,
weren't it? Yeah.
So every week, Sarah would go on site and deliver a new pack. We would have like a main pack every 2 weeks, and then we would have like sort of mid-activity in the in-between week. And Sarah would give the packs at the cell door, so on the wings, and have probably a couple of minutes to chat to the learner and get their work from maybe the previous pack. And so it was an exchange at the door. The door wouldn't open, and so packs were sort of slid down the side of the door, and a little opening at the door. And yeah, go on, Hafsa.
And just to say also, there was an exchange between Sarah and I, because of course when I would send Sarah the new pack, then we would get scanned images of the packs that had been completed, and that way for the creative process in terms of the activity, that was really important to see what the men were doing. And so it was on 2 levels, wasn't it, the exchange?
Yeah, because you hadn't really, it wasn't a case of you'd created 6 or 7 packs ready to go every fortnight. It was, let's see what the learners came back with and respond to that. So it was a huge task for you to be able to digest that information and then create something new to like move it forward in a way. And so that was the sort of practical elements of the exchange. And also we were communicating obviously over email as a sort of trio, and then to HMP Risley. And so just to give you a bit of a lay of the land of what we were working with. And so when I say challenges, some of the challenges that we had were kind of exciting and great to get your teeth into, like how can we do this without cameras? How can we do this postal engagement? And then some challenges were just possibly a pain in the bum. And so maybe, do we want to just maybe have any thoughts on the sort of challenges side of things from either of you?
I think for me, we were very much recognised, as Hafsa said, about the challenges initially around working in the prison context and what that might mean to a photography project. I think that coupled with the challenges that were presented because of COVID and the changing landscape. And I think as soon as we had a solution, the kind of pace was shifting quite quickly. So we'd devise a solution and then things would change because of the pandemic, which meant we had to rethink. So for me, it was kind of everything shifting. But I do agree. I think one of the key things, and I think it'll go on to later on to another element, I think one of the key things that made the challenges bearable was collectively, as the trio, the solutions and the communication, that we were able to recognise the barriers and then collectively come up with solutions. So even if we come up with a solution and we couldn't execute it as we'd hoped, we'd come back together. And I think that was a real testament to our commitment to the project.
Yeah, and you know, from my perspective, it was like, you know, just the challenge of you know, having these ideas, so trying to just tone it down a little bit for myself, because I'm trying to tell myself, look, Hafsa, you don't know whether tracing paper is allowed in prison. I'm like, no, but it's a really good idea to use. Yeah, but you don't, you know. And it was that conversation I was having with myself, because I was like, you know, getting into obviously the creativity of engaging. You know, I mean, you're smiling, but you know, we had to not call it tracing paper at one point, or translucent paper. So it wasn't just materials that I'm talking about here. It was also the way we communicate. Like you said, Sarah, I think one of in our evaluative meetings, what was key was like the language around stuff and how you communicate. Like, it's not that you can't use tracing paper in a prison.
Yeah.
It's the fact that you've got to explain how it's used and for what purpose. So you take for you take it just as normal, that you don't ever need to explain that this sort of material. But suddenly, in that was both interesting for me and took me a bit of getting used to, if I'm honest. And so it was a challenge to begin with.
I think that challenge, for me personally, sort of producing, I guess, was definitely working in this way, where the lines of communication, we wanted to have this project sort of very responsive, and I think we did manage that, especially like the creative side of it was really responsive with the learners. But obviously, working in a prison setting, there's certain things that kind of need to be in place at the start, to be able to get okays, further down the line. You need to sort of put this in beforehand. And so it's like, how do you have this sort of free-flowing, responsive, co-authored project when actually so much of it probably does need to be sort of set in stone, so we know where we're going and we can let Risley know, and and they know what's going on. And I think particularly around the time when we decided about the postal packs, our time and communication, I think I spent more time with you two than I did my own husband and my kid. I felt like I was probably pestering the life out of you both, because we were in each other's pocket. We had to invest a lot of time. And also I think the element of Zoom and email, we couldn't necessarily just sit in a space together for the day and hash it all out. It had to be in that way. And so, I mean, I'm going to take my hat off to both of you for putting up with it. But we did it, but it definitely needed a really big investment of time, I think.
And one really going through the process and being able to look, be at this threshold where that project's finished and now a new one's about to begin. And so what can we take further, into that project? Like, one of the things was, one of the things was, like if you're on site with someone, you've got that on site, you're there in the room, that's like 2 packs worth of like engagement, or maybe at least so that's what I kind of came away thinking. That's really what happened with the on-site. However, on the flip side, having material in a box, carefully handmade, put together with all of the users' needs considered, communication being a priority, being personable in the communication and in the letters.
Yes. All
of that might not have existed, would not have existed had it been on site. And I think one of the things that is unique about this postal engagement is the fact that we all made it happen. We went through the protocol. We ended up creating a new kind of practice, actually. A lot of the things that we're talking about, they have been done before, but not in a certain context, not in the way we had our context. So that's what I'm really proud about. I feel like we've all worked together to really push through some new practice. And I think that's what I was hoping for in a weird sort of way, because I think, I forgot the tail end of what it was I was trying to get to, but
what I did want to mention as well is how I think the packs were kind of maybe, I don't even want to put a percentage on it. In my head, I'm sort of saying 90% of the engagement, but actually there was a real sort of special 10% engagement, where that was either the exchange that happened at the door, whether that was Sarah, or the time that you went in with Sarah and the time that I went in with Sarah. And I feel like you mentioned earlier that everything is sort of amplified, and having that 5 minutes stood talking to one of the learners through a door, just about the pack and just about them in general, and it was such a huge thing in such a very small micro kind of package. And I think all of us had really incredible experiences in that exchange. So the learners might have said something to us that was just like, wow, that, you know, I think Sarah, one of your learners, you knocked on the door and they knew it was you and knew you were coming, and for you that's that kind of build up of trust and knowing that, being reliable and sort of keeping your promise, and yeah, I think that exchange at the door. Does either of you have any comments about how that affected you?
Yeah, I think in terms of that, that stems from our commitment to the project, because I think one of the things that we discussed and agreed quite early on was that if we were going to do the project, it needed that commitment, because we didn't want to disappoint the participants. We didn't want to say we were going to do this and then kind of because it wasn't working how we wanted it to, it was just going to end. So that, for me, initially the first few weeks, if you recall, we kind of got dribs and drabs of responses, but then it soon kind of picked up because we didn't take that. We kind of went back and revisited and came back with answers, and over time, and I think there was one occasion, the occasion, Emma, where we went in and there was a lot of questions. So there was one learner who had wrote questions because there was a specific ask in a task. He wasn't sure what to do, so he had a note. And then there was another learner who English wasn't his first language, so he had sat and kind of wrote it. I can't remember what language was his first language, but he'd wrote it in his own language, then used a dictionary and translated it and showed us this masses of paperwork that was a response to the task. And another one where, because we couldn't have access through the door, that there was the little package waiting outside the door, the pizza box with the completed outcomes. So it was this commitment that we had invested in was kind of being returned from the participants. And I think that kind of stemmed into some of the later activities that we've just spoken about, the camera and the photo paper, and quite humorous in a way. I mean, the photo paper activity itself, there was a note on there like don't open or do this first, but because there's a letter saying don't open, that was the first thing that people did. So it's kind of like, oh, you've spoilt it now, so it's another packing. But there was that, we were able to build up that humour and rapport, which I think really fed into the creative responses the participants was giving us over the weeks.
Yeah, I mean, I sensed that when I went in as well. Like one of the learners, you know, look, he gave back his work to you, and I was looking at it, and he'd written something really poetic in response to an image that struck him, and I mean, it struck me right there and then. You know, obviously, and in a real life situation, you know, you'd share that with your participant, with your co-creators. You know, you'd want to go to and fro, and of course time was limited and everything, but I remember saying to him that this is really quite poetic, and it was probably the first time ever for him. I mean, Sarah, you know, I think you can remember who I'm referring to here, and I forgot at that moment just those very casual ways that we talk about each other's work or efforts or whatever it is. Like in prison, it just means, and there's just another level of meaning, and yeah, and that authentic engagement I feel that you can have with prisoners about anything, I think probably goes a long way. And I think that's probably one of the things that I've learned from their responses, and just the way Sarah has been, you know, telling us about how that exchange has worked.
That also through that report that there was that gratitude for the investment that was put into the activities, and the investment in time and the quality of resources that we were giving people. I think there was a real recognition that it wasn't just kind of a purchased off the shelf,
no,
that it was really kind of considered through the selection, as you mentioned, about the nature photography. So how people's comments were then being responded to, I think that was really recognised, especially towards the end of the project, when I think that we got to a real position of kind of a really strong position, really.
Absolutely.
Overcome a lot of barriers, kind of built trust, and we're able to really move into that creative.
Yeah, and it really opened up, because the last few activities was the making of a lot of the feedback from the men was that they liked the making element. So the photo collages, the tactile stuff that you can do with images. There's a wealth of activities that you can sort of, you know, bring in. But it was a bit more than that. It was like challenging them. Like I was like,
yeah,
you know, are they going to feel like scientists in their labs or artists in their studios? Because and that's the challenge. I was thinking, right, if I and it took me ages to make 12 templates for like a pinhole, a 3D pinhole functional bit of kit there,
I think what's hard as well, Hafsa, is like you did challenge them, and in some weeks, if they didn't understand something, they did have to wait a whole week to find the answer. But they all, if they wanted the answer, which they all did, they would all remember it, write it down, ask Sarah or one of us when we went in, and so there was like an acceptance that okay, I'm going to try it again next week, and they did a couple of attempts on quite a lot of the exercises, whereas if you're doing it in a classroom, it would have been more an immediate, oh, I'm stuck, can you help me? And so it really was for them a much more elongated
and maybe just like also the fact that you're in a workshop, there's you might, as an artist, if you might feel compelled or pressured or whatever to go on to the next activity. If you're an artist, you might feel that as well, like they've done that, okay, let's go on to something else. And it's nice just to stay with things, because then if you stay with things long, then it kind of, you get really unexpected results. And the fact that they all made the camera, and the fact that Sarah, I think you said that a lot of them were like, oh, there's no more packs, or there's no more project. There was like, and that's a really good point at which to think, right, our project has been like extremely qualitatively successful. So
on that note, we've got a question from Liz, which is actually exactly what was on my notes to go next anyway, is I know this project was a pilot, so I'd love to hear, if you were to do it again, what you might change or do differently now you have been through the whole process. So Liz, what that was the pilot, and we now have 2 new projects starting, but the good thing is that one of the new projects is with Hafsa still, and in the same prison, so Risley, and with the same group. So we're able to continue with the same cohort, and they all wanted to keep going. And so Hafsa will be doing it again postally. So we're continuing the postal engagement. Any thoughts on kind of what we've learned moving forward?
I think, we took a lot of, we had, which was really lovely. Last week we had an in-person kind of collaborative gathering, and we were able to discuss everything around the table. It was bizarre. We've done it all on Zoom and so on, but it was really nice. So we were able to reflect and use that time on what worked and what didn't work, and really respond to that. And I suppose the question, I think one of the things that was the core is that importance of communication and managing expectations and being clear across, for the participants, being clear for a prison perspective, being clear about what potential outcomes could be, clear about what we want to achieve for the family. So we reflected on the successes, and then I feel that the conversations we've had and the way that we've developed that for the next project is really built on. And I mentioned the family work there because obviously that was one of our core aims. That was very much part of the project, but I think in terms of how we become quite absorbed into responding to a lot of the barriers, it was kind of, the focus kind of wasn't in the same context, because that in our initial idea it was to have in-person family visits and so on, which couldn't happen. So we had to again think creatively, and I think even again the gratitude of giving phone credit so people could extend and have conversations, which were fed back into some context. I think we've given focus to that being a really core part of the project, and that's something we've kind of considered right from the start. And then also we're looking at the family session, the open eye gallery. So that's my take on it, is that kind of, I think, the communication and that clarity.
Yeah, and just those kind of links with family. We did, in one of the packs, the last pack, we did try to get the participants to review all of the activities that they've done in all of the packs, and then select some activities to send to family members. I know I was kind of like setting up a challenge for us all there, but I thought it might be a nice way of, keeping the original aim, like you say, Sarah, pretty much at the heart. And I was thinking, there might be a way. And I think as an artist, you're always kind of tinkering with what's possible, how can it, you want the experience for your participants to be, you know, to be multidimensional, to have these elements, which is what made the commission in the first instance by Open Gallery, when they offered it as a pilot photography project, was just so unique and amazing. Really, I'd never really come across something that aimed to use photography in such a way. So I think some more of those links going forward.
Just going to do this quick question and keep an eye on the questions as we go through. Marge has just asked about the poster recruitment. So the poster was put up, and then how were the learners recruited? Did they put themselves forward? Were they selected, and by who? How many did you have participating in the end? Also, you mentioned a couple of artists that you'd been looking at when you were talking about the photo.
Yeah, I'll put that in the chat now.
Yeah. Sarah, do you want to just say about the recruitment?
Yeah, so the recruitment was done as an open kind of invite in terms of people putting themselves forward. We had a criteria around the family element because we knew that that was a core aim of the project, which meant that we had to ensure that participants had the right contact in place so that we were really kind of managing any potential risk. But ultimately it was a kind of an open call in the prison for people to put themselves forward. We did have, I think we kind of had a constant 12. I think we had a smaller core of probably 7. We lost 1 or 2 for prison transfers, and quite early on, we probably had a few more early on who tried the process but kind of wanted to hold off to the in-person. So I think that in terms of, and the way we approached it was a generic kind of posters across the whole of the prison establishment itself. So it wasn't a particular location. We kind of really scattered the posters so everybody could see them wherever they were.
Yeah, and you also mentioned, didn't you, Sarah, about how the recruited folk, you know, would already have that clearance to be able to relate to family. So that was another kind of filter, if you like. So in as much as we wanted the opportunity to, you know, exist for everyone in that community, you know, there were just some very important practical measures that had to be taken by Risley and obviously Sarah around that family dimension, because it meant that some men wouldn't have had the clearance for that side of the engagement. This is one of the key sort of things to get your head around as an artist working in prison. You know, so yeah, to mention that.
I think what's exciting about the new project, I mean, I don't know about you two, but I definitely feel in such a better position in terms of knowing this sort of format now and how we're going to go about it and what we need to put in now to be able to sort of support each of us individually and each of us as a group. Yeah, I feel like I'm in a much better place. And also just the fact that this time round, Hafsa's going to be going in to do the sort of pack exchange. So, which is completely different from the last one. So Hafsa will be going onto the wing with another member of staff and just doing that exchange. So Hafsa's going to have that 5 minutes with each learner physically at the door, and so that is a huge difference, I think, and it's going to make a huge difference for you.
And it's a nice development because the project now, it's like the offer, if you like, you know, to the group was in project 1 was this, and then now the offer in project 2 is, you know, there's more while retaining those relationships. And you know, me at, you know, Sarah at the door or me at the door, you know, we all present different opportunities, I guess. So as long as they can see that, oh, okay, there's something else for me to express and question, or, you know, with the person who's made this stuff, then you know, go for it, kind of thing. Yeah.
And I think also probably nice to add as well, in terms of the family element, we're still kind of unsure, but working on the premise that there's not going to be sort of family days with the learners, which was the sort of original plan back in the day. And so now we are looking at having a day at Open Eye Gallery for the families to come and have a day sort of with Hafsa. And yeah, so that's still on the cards. But again, it's this sort of making plans and then being flexible around it and ensuring that we have other avenues just in case. I think that's probably the biggest thing as well, that it is the flexibility of it.
Yeah, and just from my perspective, you know, I'll be really sad to see like this project, it feels a lot shorter. It feels like, but very qualitative, very deep, you know, it does have that dimension to it. But I mean, beyond that, working in prison, working, you know, with other partners, or, you know, whoever is working and wanting to work with artists in that space, then yeah, I'm all for that. I've just sort of whetted my appetite a little bit, and it's opened up, you know, practice for me in a way that I hadn't thought of before. Or and now, of course, in my studio, I'm just making photograms. I love it, and I'm actually making pinhole photographs and buying large sheets of paper to do some portrait work. So, I mean, I wouldn't have got there without this engagement with the men and with Open Eye and Novus. So
it's interesting, isn't it, Hafsa? Like, the more sort of restrictions that we were given, the more creative you had to get, which, you know, like you said, you've gone down a road that you possibly wouldn't have done. So sometimes having a sort of free, open platform to do whatever you want isn't always the best.
No, and I you know, very quickly, I've worked with, you know, medium secure patients in a mental health facility in Newcastle, and, you know, identifiability of those patients was just, you know, and it was a photography project. And although protocols and systems sort of change and move around, you do get sometimes the wrong information, or you get, you know, you don't get full information. And so, you know, a portrait project with those patients just wasn't possible after we'd finished it. And so, you know, the challenge there was, okay, how can you get these guys to make portraits without showing their faces? And actually what emerged was a body of work that was much more powerful to them and to each other in that group, and of course to me. So it works.
I'm going to follow on from that, and somebody's asked just about, is there a plan with Open Eye to exhibit participants' work? And I do want to make just a comment about sort of sharing the work, and that we are now at this stage, because we haven't really shared the outcomes, like the sort of visual outcomes from the pilot, whereas this one that's about to start, we're very much incorporating the consent within the packs at the beginning to sort of ask the learners how, where, what, in terms of what they want, where they want it shared, if they want it shared, and just having that sort of dialogue from the very beginning. Anybody else want to?
No, I think that's, I mean, the intention was to showcase the work in an external kind of output, if that's what the participants wanted for the pilot projects. I think the way that it shifted into the postal exchange, we became quite conscious that there was kind of a lot of content that was created that people might not want to share, and we worked collectively together to make that decision about how. But yeah, and I think there's a question above that about sharing it with family. Participants were encouraged to share the work with the family members, and we provided phone credit for that conversation. If we weren't running it in the postal arrangement, we would have had family days where we could have shared, and also family participants would have been able to access sessions of the same kind of activities in the gallery, and we would have come together and shared work in that way. It's this learning that we're aiming to build forward for the next project, so the family and the sharing of work is kind of at the forefront.
And I would add to that, Georgie, the question about, was it always a big aspect of the project? Well, that you say specifically that it was a form of communication with loved ones. I mean, that's the way I framed it. But in the original aim, the nature of that connection between the men and their families was really open, of course. You know, Novus, you know, we didn't know it was a pilot project. We were just sort of like thinking, what form could it take? And I think doing the packs and having a phone credit and, you know, trying to generate some sort of exchange, you know, it wasn't as productive as we might have thought at that point. There were some elements of it that were the conversations between the men and the family, but
also, I was just going to say, it's not that straightforward to be able to connect to the family from an external perspective. You know, we have to rely on the learners to be able to contact their families. And so we do have ideas about sort of having a space online that families can connect to, but we are always reliant on on that way of the communication getting
Yeah.
to the family. So it's an interesting challenge.
For me, you know, as a writer director, I'm completely like into that world of that domestic family space, and the way we relate to each other in that space, and there's sort of like the real drama and beauty of living collectively with the ones we love, and you know, the ones we are responsible for, and you know, and want to care for, and all those things. You know, I mean, that whole terrain is really, really rife with meaning and story. So, you know, when you say it was a form of communication, photography can be a form of communication, and to position that question is in itself quite interesting, because the question is, can photography become a form of communication between, you know, family members who are imprisoned for things that they've got to spend time for, they've got to serve out a sentence, and just the nature of that impacting on families. What would photography become in that space? You know, I think, yeah, as an artist question, it's really quite exciting to think more about that.
And that's great, because we have a lot more time to think about it with our next project. I'm aware of time, and so it's 27 minutes past 7. So I'm just going to give a little bit at the end. Yeah, I just wanted to say we have, like I mentioned earlier, we have the kind of next project starting very soon with Hafsa, with the same cohort at Risley, but we also have another project with a new artist, Simon Bray, artist in residence with us, who's working at HMP Thorncross, and they will be sort of working side by side, really. Both projects are running simultaneously. Simon will be working in person, so like in workshops with 2 groups at Thorncross. Both prison settings are very, very different, and both artists are working in really different ways, and so we're really excited to see how both these projects sort of develop alongside each other. I want to thank Hafsa and Sarah for joining us tonight. I also really want to thank you both for your hard work, determination, and your patience to keep the engagement and the relationship going with the group of learners and with me through a really challenging time. I'm just really, really proud of what was achieved, and I can't wait to see what we do next. Thank you to everyone that's joined tonight. I hope you've enjoyed hearing more about the project and our relationship with Novus. We're now going to head over to our Discord channel, if you'd like to join us, where we can kind of continue this discussion. So if you've got any questions, I think there's one more question, which I kind of feel like I want to do before we do it. Hafsa, what sort of material did you need to supply to the institution to offer a benefit versus risk comparison, proof to show benefit of the programme? I get what you mean. So the materials, if there was a potential element of risk, how did you balance that with showing the benefit? Sarah, is there?
Sarah, I just spoke to Sarah. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, I think
Nancy.
In terms of the materials, I think it's just being mindful of what could be perceived as a risk. There is a list of items that aren't prohibited in the prison, and just being mindful what they might be, and if we needed some of those activities, some of those resources, what could be used instead. So, I mean, yeah, we didn't have that many, to be honest. I think some of the equipment that we initially explored around the cameras, that's not normal. So kind of providing kit lists and assurances of how we would manage that equipment on site. And I think, again, it comes back to communication, having that really honest conversation about what we intended to achieve. This is why we'd need the materials. And we did have no's on some occasions, because there was a risk that we perhaps didn't foresee, or we didn't look at it in that context. Or
yeah. I'm just sorry, Sarah. I'm just laughing at myself, because you won't know this, but the amount of times I've asked the question, oh right, you can't have cameras in. I wonder if I could use a Polaroid camera. Okay, you can't do that. I wonder if I could have some like a disposable camera. It took me ages to just
like whittle it down.
No cameras, no electronic moving parts in a small light.
No, that's a lie though. That's a lie, because you say no cameras, but the learners had a camera in their room.
Indeed, they did.
Camera.
Indeed.
So did get there in the end. And on that note, I think that's a great place to stop. But I thank you so much for joining us tonight, you pair. Thank you for everyone for joining us. Have a good evening, and if you want to go over to the Discord channel, we will see you there.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Bye.